Hello, friends. Let us learn about the Government of India Act 1935 together in a very simple and interesting manner. To understand what was the Government of India Act 1935, we have to look at why was the Government of India Act 1935 introduced in the first place. The Government of India Act was a set of rules on how to govern India amidst all the chaos that was breaking loose. From the very beginning, we see that the government of Britain or the British government, our colonial masters, were trying hard to come up with rules and regulations to rule the Indian people. A Government of India Act 1919 was introduced earlier, but sadly it was very inadequate and unsatisfactory. Then a Simon Commission was sent to India to regain control of the revolting Indian population. However, not a single Indian was represented in the Simon Committee, therefore, it was rejected. It was vehemently rejected by the Indians and it was sent back. However, the Simon Committee, it presented its report in 1927 to the British government. To discuss the recommendations of those of that report, RTCs were held, that is the roundtable conferences. But the roundtable conferences also failed. And the British had already, mentioned this that if the RTCs failed, then they would come up with their own proposals. So in March 1933, the British government came up with their own proposals and published all those proposals in a white paper. A white paper is basically a discussion document. Before those recommendations actually become a law or a bill, they have to be discussed before that. So discussions were held on those, recommendations by the British politicians, and the British politicians also involved safe Indian delegates. They consulted the safe Indian delegates. And who were these safe Indian delegates? The British people or the British politicians, they had handpicked some of the Indians who they considered as safe, meaning those Indians had a soft corner for the British. So they consulted only with them. And finally, the bill was introduced before the British Parliament in December 1934, and in August 1935, the Government of India Act 1935 became a law. Now let us look at what was the Government of India Act 1935. According to the Government of India Act 1935, India was to become a federation. A federation means a system of governance where power is shared between the center and the provinces. And in the federation, there would be British Indian provinces and the princely states both. And At the central level, the British government introduced a bicameral legislature, which means that there were now would be two houses. For example, if you look at the present Pakistan system of governance, we have two houses at the center, the Senate and the National Assembly. The Senate is the upper house and the National Assembly is the lower house. Likewise, the British government introduced a bicameral. Bicameral, we mean a two-house legislature at the center. There was an upper house, and the upper house was to be called as the Council of States, and the lower house, which was the Assembly. In the Council of State, there were 156 members from the British Indian provinces, and those members were to be elected, and 104 members from the princely states, and those members were to be nominated. In the lower house, which is the Assembly, 250 members were from the British Indian provinces, and those members had to be elected, and 125 members from the princely states, and those members had to be nominated. By nominated, we mean that the British government was itself selecting members from the princely states. Okay, so obviously they'll select those people who were favorable for their government. Then, diarchy, which was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919, was completely abolished at the provincial level. However, it was retained at the central governmental level. Now, the central governmental level had to administer some of the selective subjects like defense, foreign affairs, ecclesiastical affairs, and administration of tribal areas. Ecclesiastical, by that term, we mean all the affairs of the church or the clergy. So, they kept these affairs under their own control. So these selective subjects, there were four subjects: defense, foreign affairs, ecclesiastical affairs, and administration of the tribal areas. These affairs were to be administered solely by the Governor General, and in administering these affairs, he was to be assisted by three appointed councillors. Right. So the system of diarchy was abolished at the provincial level, but it was retained at the central governmental level. At the provincial level, diarchy was replaced by a system of governance in which the provinces now had larger degree of autonomy. That is, they had larger amount of power. The ministers of the provinces were considered to be the heads of the provincial administration, and the provincial governors were to act on the advice of the provincial ministers, except in special areas where the provincial governors had special responsibilities. That is, during times when the peace of the province was threatened or the rights of the minorities were threatened, then the provincial governor's decision what was to stand supreme. Then the number of the provinces was also increased or raised, and it was taken to 11. NWFP, Northwest Frontier Province, was to be made a province on its own, a full fledged province, and there were two new provinces introduced, Orissa and Sindh. The provinces were also bicameral, like the center, meaning there were two houses at the provincial level as well. Now, the Governor General was the head of the federation and he had special powers. Special powers in the reserve subjects. We discussed those reserve subjects, the four reserve subjects. That is foreign affairs, ecclesiastical affairs, and the administration of the tribal areas. Okay, and then defense as well. And then the provincial governors also were given special powers. They had the right to dismiss the ministers and also the whole of the administration if there was a need. And then they could rule by proclamation during emergency, meaning their would act as supreme. Then the princes rejected the new arrangements because they saw that their powers were being compromised. So they rejected the new arrangements. And when they rejected the new arrangements, a part of the act which talked about the central government was not introduced at all. Okay. Then there was limited franchise, meaning um, the power to vote was granted to a sizable amount of population, but it was still restricted. Why? On the basis of property qualification. Only 25% of the population had the right to vote in the provincial elections. Now discussing the reaction. What was the reaction to this Government of India Act 1935? It was opposed. The princes were very unhappy because of the loss of the power. Nehru regarded this as a charter of slavery, and he said that it was a machine with strong brakes but no engine. And then Jinnah also, used the words thoroughly rotten, fundamentally bad, totally unacceptable when he described the Government of India Act 1935. Now, the act, we also have to look at the positive points of this act. Why, how can we say that, this act contributed towards the Pakistan movement, or what was its role towards the formation of Pakistan? The act actually became a basis for future negotiations because, there were solid rules and set in the act. And it was like, the country was inching towards parliamentary form of government. A bicameral legislature was introduced at the center. Even at the provinces, diarchy was abolished. So, these were some of the positive points of the act. So, they became the basis for future negotiations. And this act actually led to elections. And then, after the elections, there was a strong realization on the part of the Muslim League that now is the time, more than ever, that independence should be achieved or freedom should be achieved from the British government. The parliamentary form of it was a parliamentary form of government, an introduction of the parliamentary form of government, so that was a plus point. And finally, this whole thing, it led to complete independence, meaning the coming of the Government of India Act and the efforts that were made after it. All of that led to complete independence. Now, let us discuss the questions that can come from this topic. Explain why there was opposition to the Government of India Act 1935. It will come as a 7 mark question. If it comes as a 7 mark question, you have to write three paragraphs and divide the points in those three paragraphs. In the last paragraph, you can also conclude your answer. So, here, why was there opposition to the Government of India Act? Pick up all the negative points of the Government of India Act. For example, there was still diarchy at the center, although it got abolished from the provinces, but at the central level it was still intact. And the governor general enjoyed special powers. There were reserved subjects which were dealt solely by the governor general and his three councillors, like the defense, foreign affairs, ecclesiastical affairs, and tribal areas administration. And these were the main areas where the Indian population wanted to exert their control, but the British government had on purpose kept these areas under their control. Then you can talk about how the provincial governors still had a lot of authority on the provincial ministers, and those provincial governors they could proclaim emergency whenever they felt that the rights of the minorities or the peace of the land was being threatened. So that also, in that way also, the British government was keeping power in their control, although seemingly it felt that it looked as if that the power was being transferred to the Indian population, but in reality the power still rested with the British government. And then you can talk about how the princes were not happy with how the things were, and how they were losing control over their lands. And then you can also write about the franchise, limited amount of franchise, which is given to the Indian population on the basis of property qualification. So that was also a negative point of the Government of India Act 1935. With that, you will be able to summarize your answer and write a very good answer for this question. Another question that can be asked is, explain the importance of the Government of India Act 1935 to the future of the subcontinent. And this I discussed a little while earlier. How are you to write your answer? That it became a basis for future negotiations. Then it prompted the Muslim League, to move towards independence, or to, strive or work hard for complete independence from India. Because after the Government of India Act, we'll see that elections were announced, and then the coming up of Congress, and how the Muslim League and the Muslims were treated after it. And then, this basically was, and then the Government of India Act 1935, in a way, was it had introduced a parliamentary system of governance. And later on, it also became an interim constitution for both the states after independence. After Pakistan and India got independence, they took up this Government of India Act 1935 as their interim constitution once they got freed from this colonial rule. So with that, you can make up a good answer and explain all your points here. So with this, I conclude. So if you look at the Government of India Act 1935, and you study the way things have been explained in this video, it will not be a very difficult task. I can guarantee that. So till my next video, I'm signing off. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye.